Welcome back to Invest Africa. Still with me in studio, Yunus, Suleman, Chairman of KPMG Africa, and Dianna Games, Chief Executive of Africa at Work and Honorary CEO of the South African-Nigeria Chamber of Commerce. Just before the break, we were talking about the so-called skewed perception of trade, and we heard in the insert that there is this perception that trade is very imbalanced, and the gentleman actually referred to it as a vicious cycle. So just to put into perspective from an investor point of view looking into Africa, it is said that Nigeria should reach 7% of GDP contribution, as South Africa would grow at around about 3%. How does one put that in perspective in terms of which is the more viable country to invest in?
I think from a South African point of view, you're absolutely right. Our growth rate is really much lower than Nigeria, and there are huge opportunities in certain sectors. You know, I've always heard this comment made that oil was a curse for Nigeria because all the other industries were neglected. And I think one specific industry is agriculture. And you know, we have significant experience in that region. And so I think more we can help with agriculture. And
agriculture is very big for Nigeria as well. They have many government-led projects to develop areas of agriculture in communities and
and they have the right products to serve the nation in terms of food security. So it's one area where there could be development. In addition to that, there's also a question of mining. You know, we have significant mining houses, and there needs to be more of an opportunity to invest into Nigeria in that regard. Because I think there's that imbalance, like we heard. And the thing is, it's literally on the context of oil being the biggest, call it, reason why there's an imbalance. But we've got huge potential to really export and also set up investment. Let's say Nigeria is an investment destination, whether it's in manufacturing especially, and specifically in sugar. I mean, Nigeria only produces about 3% of their sugar that they consume. And if we could export that kind of, let's call it, skill, like we've got in South Africa, it would be phenomenal for Nigeria.
So we know this, but how do we actually get to the point where these kinds of issues are being negotiated at the business level and at government level? Are these two aspects working hand in hand, Dianna?
Well, we do have a binational commission between the two governments, which was set up in 1999. It's been a sort of a success in some respects, and there's some agreements that have been negotiated and so on. But on the whole, business is not really involved in that whole binational process. So I think you've got sort of two parallel tracks on the whole. You've got business looking at what the opportunities are. You've got government that is negotiating agreements. So, you know, I think business is not always aware what they are and how they would be useful. But I think we have a positive political relationship. We've got, you know, two diplomatic missions in Nigeria, and we have a lot of positive, you know, a lot of goodwill there. And I think the two governments, what I've certainly seen in the last year even, is that the governments are working a lot more at looking to see how we can work, you know, putting a lot of these problems about the skewed trade balance and things that shouldn't affect the relationship because they are just the realities of the marketplace in many respects. But looking at how we can proactively do something about improving, you know, agriculture, as Yunus said, I think that's a key one, and developing skills. And I think South Africa has a lot to offer in terms of training and so on, both in South Africa and outside. And there's a lot of talk now about how we can be far more proactive in terms of all of those things.
What specifically is the South African-Nigeria Chamber of Commerce looking at regarding this?
Well, what we do is we sort of help to facilitate business and information. You know, we're not a cure-all and you know, we do what a chamber generally does, and we pass on advice to our members. We do a lot of networking. We interact a lot with the diplomatic missions and try and get, you know, ministers to come and talk and share information with our members and so on. And we have a lot of networking events with corporates and so on. So, but from our side, we are trying to develop more of a relationship with Nigerians coming to South Africa, or linking people directly and seeing more interaction on that level between the sort of corporates in both countries. Even though companies are doing that on their own, we like to see it as a more symbolic thing, that we would be doing stuff that highlights our engagement with Nigeria very specifically. There aren't a lot of Nigerian companies here. There are however, a lot of Nigerian professionals here, which is a slightly different thing. But we have certainly benefited from Nigerian skills. You know, so these are things that we can build on in the relationship from the chamber side. Certainly.
Because it must be tricky. I mean, on the one hand, as we know, South Africa has a stable democracy. It has a diversified economy and a very strong services sector, particularly financial services sector. On the other hand, we've seen Nigeria with a very strong oil sector. So it must be quite challenging to be able to work out a balance between the two in terms of equitably exploring equal opportunities.
I think the main point is that we both can learn from each other. And what we have done over the years as KPMG is exchange, let's call it, resources. Recently, one of our senior managers with his wife moved to Nigeria for a 2 or 3 year stint. And similarly, we encourage them to come to South Africa. So I think that encourages more diversity, which I think is very important. So I think it's about dialogue, it's about sharing knowledge, and the more we do of that, the better. I think probably what we would hope to happen in the new year after Mangawang, that the president, whoever is elected, would then travel to Nigeria, being the second largest economy on the continent. And I think that's the way to improve relations and to also improve trade.
So the tone needs to be set from the top.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what we need more of. More visits by both presidents and also trade ministers, and to encourage the relationship to really grow faster than where we are at the moment. I think in the past there has been greater interest in traveling more frequently. But in the appointment of Nkosazana Zuma, it's also a major plus for the African continent, because she is excellent. She is now one of the most powerful women on the continent, and she can help bridge the gap between the two countries and all the other countries in Africa.
Do you think she now does have the buy-in of Nigeria?
I would hope so. I think when we looked at the elections, there didn't seem to be that support. But I think that hopefully they've grown to accept her, and I would believe that they will accept her if they haven't already. And I think she is competent, and that's the difference. She's the right person for the job, and I think that the more time she can visit Nigeria and get to know them better, the better it'll be for all of us in the continent.
If one had to break down those opportunities that exist, if you had the opportunity to advise her from a business point of view, what would be your advice to her specifically, if we could break it down a little bit in terms of consensus building?
Well, I was privy to a discussion that was held recently, and what she's talking about is having specialized universities to develop the resources and develop the skills. And I think that's a very good start. And so what I would encourage is that's a great start in having what you call, let's call it a language or journalistic university in Cameroon, for example, and something else in South Africa or in East Africa. That's a great start. But I think the more time she would spend in Nigeria and other countries really where there's huge opportunity for building relationships, the better it'll be. And I think we as KPMG have given her our support to say, what can we do? Because we've got a huge footprint in Africa, and how can we support the initiatives of the AU in making that impact across the continent?
Dianna, do you agree with Yunus? Is that the place to start, do you think?
Well, I think that building relationships, whatever we can do to that end, would be a very good start. I think there's been too much talk of the competition between, say, Nigeria and South Africa for things that don't even exist. For example, an extra UN seat. It also negates the idea that we should, we should have more than one African representative in the G20, for example. We're actually doing ourselves down by arguing over something that actually we should be expanding the pie rather than looking and settling for the status quo on those in that regard, because it does have implications. Nigeria is always a big power in Africa, and still is, and certainly in its region, and we are in our region, and I think that we need to look beyond the national sort of framework for opportunity and for building bridges that business can then benefit from underneath that.
From your point of view, when do you think we'll get to a stage where more Nigerian businesses will be set up in South Africa, apart from the professionals being here? I mean, we know that there are over 100 South African companies in Nigeria.
I get back to the idea that the opportunity is in Nigeria, and what you are seeing coming out of Nigeria is Nigerian multinationals who are spreading their wings certainly across West Africa and across Southern and East Africa, and certainly in terms of some of the banks, UBA, for example. So the market in West Africa alone is huge, and I think if we're trying to sort of make the numbers fit, that's not going to work. The West African market, the Nigerian market itself, is big enough to soak up almost everything you can throw at it, certainly for the foreseeable future, because of the massive underdevelopment. So I think that's not really the way I would view it. But having said that, Nigerians can come here, they can set up here. There's nothing stopping them. And I think perhaps they also see the high levels of competition here, It's not the place where you're getting high returns on your investment and so on. It's a highly competitive market. It's very structured in a way that is difficult to operate in, particularly for companies used to being in a much freer sort of environment, if you like, regulatory and otherwise. So I would say that that's, to me, is not the actual question. The question is, how can Nigerian companies grow and expand across the continent rather than South Africa specifically? I think that gets back to that kind of looking at the competition between the two countries. All we're doing is fueling that, really, with having that, by sticking to that kind of viewpoint.
And of course, we've also got other growing countries in Africa as well. Let's look at, take Rwanda as an example. May only have a population of just over 2 million, but the economy is growing, so there's competition.
Yeah. No, I think that Nigerians want high returns. They're used to high returns. So South Africa, being a developed market, mature environment, would not give them the returns they can get from other African countries. So it's not a priority. And I think that's where the challenge is, that we need to make it attractive to get more Nigerians to invest in South Africa. And I think South African companies have increased significantly over the last 10 years.
So what are we looking at there to make things more attractive?
I think it's the rate of return, and the growth rates are not there. So it's a catch-22. With growth rates less than 3%, doesn't suit Nigerians. They want much higher. They're used to 7% or above.
Hotter economies.
Yeah, hotter economies. So I think it's, when you talk about the tone at the top, I think if we get the right tone set at the top in terms of economic growth, and I think the platform being set by the National Development Plan will be a good starting point, in that we're trying to focus on the key things like education as well as the unemployment rate. And if we get that formula right,
Labour policies as well.
Labour policies as well. We get that formula right, it will be much more attractive to non-South Africans to come and invest here.